Hi, I'm Jan Risher. Welcome to our Louisiana Inspired Book Club. Today we are talking about and with the author, Amor Towles, Rules of Civility, and so many other, three other fabulous books. And we would like to welcome Amor now from his home in New York City.
Hello, everyone.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jan. Thanks for having me.
It's nice to see you again.
Yes, yes, exactly. It wasn't long ago.
And how was your experience in New Orleans for the book festival?
Oh, I love New Orleans, so it's very pleasant to have a reason to come to anything in New Orleans. But I'm, was interviewed by Michael Lewis, who's a friend, so that was a great pleasure. It was fun to spend some time with Walter Isaacson, who's of course a giant. So it was all told a lovely visit.
I was at your interview with Michael Lewis, and very entertaining.
Good.
I was glad his mother warned you.
Yes.
So thanks so much for joining us. And we've had so many people who read the book again or for the first time. And people have written in a few questions. I thought we would start with a few reader questions, if you're cool with that.
Totally fine.
So John Arthurs from New Orleans ask, he's just curious what the Russian element or connection or interest that is so often found in your writing.
Yeah, it's sort of an odd thread, isn't it? It's not a its role in Rules of Civility was totally different than its role in A Gentleman in Moscow. In some ways, that's a coincidence that the two happened. Gentleman in Moscow was a story. I wanted to write a story about a man trapped in a hotel. It just made so much sense to set it in Soviet Russia, where house arrest had existed for centuries. And I knew a lot about Russian culture and history. And so it felt very natural to imagine a story in that country, that story. In the case of Rules of Civility, it was different. And really what it comes down to is in the invention of a character, you are trying to figure out the personality of the individual, their background, until you can sort of visualize them and hear them, more importantly. And I knew that Katie was going to be somebody who, for instance, one of the things I would remind myself was that she would never marry for money. That was not her style. She's got a little bit too much pride for that, and a little bit too much ambition for that, to be on somebody's arm, as it were. And she would not chase that. So I kind of knew that, and I knew that she was going to be a reticent person. She wasn't going to be open about everything she was thinking or feeling to those around her. She'd be observant. And so in construct, and I knew she'd be working class, probably the child of an immigrant, therefore interested in climbing the social ladder of New York and the professional ladder of New York, given her upbringing. So you kind of take all this, and then you start saying, well, what if she was just daughter of a, maybe she isn't an immigrant. She could be, daughter of a working class family in Brooklyn, that's been in New York for a century. Or she could be French. She could be a Spaniard. You start to roll through what it would mean to be from one of these places. And in the end, as soon as I thought of Russia, I thought, oh yeah, that's perfect. Because there's something about the Russian immigrant community at the time. They were coming out of very tough environments. And so they were very kind of hardened already when they arrived in the city, and we're sort of very proud. And so I sort of like this idea that Katie would sort of inherit that from her father, and what glimpses we get of her father are very sort of influenced by this notion of toughness. You may recall the anecdote, and then I'll stop on this, but you may recall the anecdote that her uncle tells her that on the day that her father and her uncle arrived in America, he destroyed all their rubles, and kind of as to make it clear that they were going to have to make it on their own from scratch in the American economic environment, and they couldn't rely on old Russian friends or old Russian money in the Russian neighborhood. They were going to push forward, and which is obviously a dramatic thing to do, but very, again, consistent with sort of the Russian psychology. So she would inherit, in some degree, that kind of a mindset. And I thought that would suit her very well.
It was kind of a burn all the ships mentality.
Correct.
Whenever, I'm a journalist, I write, and I tried fiction, but I failed miserably because I couldn't make difficult things, terrible things happen to my characters.
Okay.
And even something like whenever I read that they destroyed the rubles, I was just like, oh, so stressed about it. Do you ever struggle with that, or you just know that you have to do it for the good story?
I don't struggle with that, but I guess the difference is that I know it rarely even comes up as a thought, because in I'll take a step back, which is to share the fact that the way that I approach writing a novel, and I've written fiction since I was a kid. I wrote it at Yale, I wrote it at Stanford in graduate school, so I've written fiction all my life. The way that I approach the writing of a novel is I will have an idea, a notion that can be described quite quickly. In the case of Rules of Civility, I think it's what you would guess, which is that at the age of 25, I looked at the Walker Evans photographs that he had taken on the city subways in New York. And I learned while reviewing those photographs that he had refused to share them at the time, but then ultimately agreed to show them at MoMA in the 60s. And as I was going through them, I thought, oh, that's interesting. Can you imagine if somebody in 1966 at the opening at MoMA recognized an old friend from the Depression era in one of these anonymous subway photographs? And as I kept going through them, I stopped and thought, wait a second, what if the same woman recognized the same guy in two photographs, but between photograph 1 and photograph 2, the man had undergone such a transformation that she's the only one at the opening that can tell it's the same guy in the two pictures. And I wrote that down on a piece of paper when I was about 25 years old. And that goes into a box, in essence, where I've got all kinds of ideas and journals and things. When I was in my 40s at this point, I decided I was going to do a new novel. I drew that idea out of the box and said, okay, this is the one I'm going to do. Now, when I make a commitment like that, I will spend a couple of years designing the book. And that means that I will try to imagine everything that happens, the characters and their backgrounds, like I was just describing with Katie, all the settings, the interactions, the arguments, the romances, whatever, some of the objects that are around them. I'll just keep digging deeper and deeper into my imagination so I can picture the entire narrative. And I will fill notebooks by hand with this material as I explore the different elements of the novel. Now, after a number of years, I will get to the point where I really know just about everything there is to know, almost. And at that point, I will outline what the idea in detail. It could be a 40-page outline, and then I'll start to write. So I have this long process. Now, the reason this is important to understand in terms of your question is that you have to picture that by the time I'm writing a character, I've spent years imagining their circumstances. So who are they? Why are they where they are? What's happening to them? How are they responding to them? And when you're doing that as a novelist, what you're really hoping to do is to get in their head so that you're not deciding really what happens to them per se. You aren't deciding what they say. You're not putting words in their mouth. On the contrary, what you're doing is having fully imagined the individual with their particular personality and their particular background, and having put them in a circumstance in which I've never been, you start to watch, in essence, and see what they're going to choose to do. So I say all that because whether something they do ends up being good or bad for them, ends up being tragic or positive, is to some degree a byproduct of the fate of who they are, rather than the fate of the narrator. Much as any of us, when we look back on the bad decisions that we've made in our lives, whatever they are, they often were is a combination of some aspect of our personality that we don't quite overcome, a circumstance that allowed us to do the thing that we aren't particularly proud of, it wasn't as simple as to say, I wish I hadn't done that. Because there's a lot of momentum that's taking us to that moment where we say the thing we shouldn't have said, or we take the action we shouldn't have taken. And to some degree, as I say, that's, it's not fate in the Greek sense. It's fated in the sense that your personality and your background are moving you towards sort of this inevitable action, which of course you then try to overcome over time. And then you may change the trajectory of how you do things. And that, as a novelist, you're attending to that concept too.
So whenever you are, you've told me before that you worked 5 years laying it all out and writing the novel. Are you seeing the characters and their physical attributes? I know to some degree you certainly are, but in terms of the connection between casting, and I know that you weren't directly involved with casting A Gentleman in Moscow, but how was it to go from that having been in your head and your mind to the physicalness of it, of the characters and even the sets for the television series A Gentleman in Moscow?
Well, the answer is that I really don't think about what my characters look like. It's one of the things that I really least in, it doesn't matter to me too much. And it's actually something I rarely even write into my work. So meaning if you go back and look at the Lincoln Highway, there's almost no physical description of Emmett, of Duchess, of Billy. We know their ages. We kind of know the environments that they're growing out of. But we don't have a keen description of what they look like. This is true in A Gentleman in Moscow. We learn that he's tall and that he has a big mustache at the beginning. But that's about it. You never learn much more than that. In the case of Rules of Civility, and I remember this in the writing of it very vividly, again, Katie does not describe herself for us at the beginning. She doesn't say, I am a brunette who's or whatever. We're listening to her, and we're kind of left to imagine who she is visually in our own minds. But and there's a moment quite late in the book where she and Tinker have had their falling out, and he calls her in her apartment, and she suddenly goes into this digression. She says, when I was a kid, I was the tallest, girl in my class, or something to that effect, and they call her Grasshopper, to tease her. And she said, it made life tough at that time. She said, but the advantage of it, now, this age, is that from the chair that you're reading in, you can reach out your leg and tip over the table with the phone on it, and you had, and that hangs up the phone without even having to get out of your chair, And that's the first time that we kind of learn she's a long-legged, woman, and I think so. I like the fact, much in the same way we only learn that she's a Russian background and that she speaks Russian because at the bar, someone speaks to her in Russian and she responds. Up until that moment, we don't know. And I'll add that in the first draft of the first chapter, I did include some of this stuff, some of her background, the fact she'd lost her mother, that her father was an immigrant, some of her physical attributes, and it just bugged me, And I thought to myself, what, Katie, if you met her, she would never tell you that stuff. And so it made no sense for her to be telling you that now as the reader. And I liked the fact, as soon as I pulled it out, it kind of creates electricity. Every time we learn a little something about her at an unexpected moment in the book, it's sort of a little, oh my God, okay, wow, she's Russian, And that's such a better way, I think, to have the reader sort of building their sense of the character themselves. So as I say, I really don't care about the appearance of my characters very much. I rarely write about them visually. I'm much more concerned with what they sound like. Because, and some of my work, Rules of Civility is unique in my body of work in that it's a first-person singular approach. So you only hear from one person in essence, and but it's very tonal, right? You kind of what Katie sounds like, how she would describe a room, what kind of judgment she might make if she met you or a stranger, and that's part of what you're hoping to do. Maybe this wasn't successful for all of you readers, but you're hoping to get to the point where you as the reader can hear her voice, and that gives you a sense of personality, a sense of how she's going to behave. She will surprise you occasionally, just as our friends will, and that's okay too. It has to be in a way that you're like, oh yeah, right, she would do that, and so you have to kind of think through all those kinds of elements. But as I say, for me, it's really the sound of the characters more than what they look like.
Great. You had mentioned earlier that you have a lot of knowledge about Russian history. Did you study that in college or?
No, it's really built into my life as a reader. So I decided I want to write fiction in first grade. When I was in first grade, our teacher, Mrs. Gom, brought a poet to the classroom, a guy named David McCord, who was a very well-known juvenile poet in New England at the time, meaning that he wrote poetry for the young. And he read his poems to us. And then he handed out books and signed them. And, and we went home with them. And I just loved everything about it. I loved sort of seeing that this guy came to our class. I loved the play of language in the poems, the rhymes that he was choosing, the way that he was observing very simple things and building his poetry out of his observation skills. I loved the fact that we were all attentive to him. I loved having the signed book. At the time, it was sort of like one of the most precious things I ever owned, at that point, right? And it probably wasn't even that precious. It was a paperback, whatever, but it felt very precious. And right away I decided, I want to be a writer. I get it. That's what I want. And so I began writing poems, like McCord, right then in first grade. And then that began this long-term process of reading something, becoming intrigued by it, writing something that might draw from that. And I fell in love with Ray Bradbury's science fiction short stories as a teenager, a young teenager. I fell in love with Agatha Christie murder mysteries as a 13 or 14-year-old, what have you, or James Bond, Ian Fleming's books. But then around 17, in high school, you suddenly read a book which is I don't know, take your pick, but you read a work of Dickens or what have you, and Jane Austen or and Tom Sawyer, fine, Mark Twain. You've been all in this trajectory from first grade to the age of 17. You're convinced you want to play with language for the rest of your life. You're convinced that you want to be a storyteller, and you love the art of storytelling as a reader and aspirationally as a writer. You know that. But suddenly you read one of these books that we today view as classics, let's say. And I was like, oh, okay. Now I get it. This is what is possible, right, in the art form of storytelling, right? Okay, we've done Hardy Boys, we've done Ray Bradbury science fiction stories, we've done Ian Fleming, and they're all fun. They're great fun. But when you enter one of these worlds, it's a totally different experience where the way you walk into the world and you can kind of see it in its entirety, the emotional impact the characters can have on you, the intellectual impact that it can have on you, the appreciation for the art of the beauty of the language itself. All these things are sort of reveal themselves at that moment. And then you're like, okay, now I understand what I really want to do. It's not simply, I don't want to simply be a storyteller.
Right.
I create novels that can have this scope, this richness, this impact on a reader. And then you start gunning for that. And there's all kinds of efforts around developing craft to achieve that end. Now I lay all that out because in what happens from that point forward is you're hunting. You're hunting for different ways of storytelling that could inform your own artistic sensibility. So you discover Faulkner. You're like, wow. You go and read 6 novels of Faulkner, and maybe even do a tour through the Gothic South, reading Eudora Welty, Flannery O'Connor, and saying, okay, this is interesting. This group in the Jim Crow era doing this kind of work, which is very unusual or interesting. And then you move on and you discover the magical realists, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and you read multiple of his books and his peers. Or you go back and read Borges and then Fuentes and Cortázar. And then you discover the Russians, same thing. And you say, oh my God, Dostoevsky, that was amazing. So you read more Dostoevsky, then you read Tolstoy, and then you Gogol and Chekhov. And you're like, what an incredible thing that all these giants were writing around the same time in 19th century Russia. And that's really where, for me, my knowledge of Russia grew out of that experience as a reader, really. Because I did not study it in school. I do not speak Russian. I do not have a Russian lineage of any kind. So it really is just, as a lover of reading works of and about Russian culture, that I ultimately gained some facility with speaking about that world.
I love to, before I travel to a new place, I try to read as much fiction set in or by locals as possible, because like you, I mean, it just gives you this sense that you can't not get in other ways, from my perspective. So
yes.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about your story you just told about the book. Do you still have the book?
Which book?
The one that the poet gave you.
That's a good question. I don't think I do. I did keep it for a long time, but it didn't survive one of those moves that we go through in our lives. But what I do have, kind of embarrassingly, is the actual journal in which I was writing the poetry in the first grade. And that kind of is revealing, I guess, in this weird way, right? That somehow, even as a boy, I was like, I'm keeping this. one day this is going to be valuable to me, to have this record of the poetry that I wrote. Of course, it's not valuable at all. But anyway, so yes, I do have that.
We're having a little bit of a crises here with power, so Lauren's about to help me fix it. Sorry for the problem here. All right. Our next question is from Nancy Shepard. And she asked, why did you choose to write from a female's point of view?
When I described having the idea and visualizing this opening at MoMA, where a person sees a friend in two photographs, from the very first day, it was a woman looking at the photographs, it was a guy in the picture. That's just immediately the way the idea presented itself to me. And that's typically what happens. I kind of know that kind of thing right off the bat. And I didn't hesitate to follow that instinct. I have to say, and some of you may be like, he writes a woman terribly, so hopefully others who don't feel that way. But I come from that school of writing that when I was young, really what the art of developing my craft, what I would do is you'd write from all kinds of different perspectives. So you'd write, about a Viennese violin repairman, or a violin manufacturer in the 19th century. Then you write about a young woman at Berkeley in the 60s. And you'd write about a young African American in Atlanta, during the Jim Crow era. Whatever. You just keep moving, writing stories in different times, different places, different people, and you do this because what you're really trying to do is kind of like I was describing earlier, is gain the ability to capture the internal intelligence of a human being, the emotional resonance of a human being, by imagining being in their place. And what that requires is ultimately, again, hearing them. How would they talk? Would they be witty or would they be dry? Would they be abrupt? Would they be overflowing with examples, or would they hold back and rarely tell you what was on their mind? This is personality traits, just like in our circle of friends, and you're trying to capture that in the writing. So you have to write from all different kinds of personalities and backgrounds to gain command over the way in which the semantics changes, the poetry changes, the vocabulary, the different themes. So by the time I wrote that book in my 40s, the idea of whether it was a woman or not really it wouldn't have given me a moment's hesitation. It's just another, who's the best person to tell the story is ultimately what you're asking yourself. Jan, you may have frozen.
Okay.
There you are. Do I hear you? Well, hello, Louisiana. What can I tell you? I'll tell you this is a sort of funny little anecdote, which is that I grew up with a woman in New Orleans. We were great friends, grew up every summer together, and she had 6 siblings, with a whole family in New Orleans. I knew them well. I know them well, the Conways. And anyway, one of the Conways said to me not long ago, kind of was like, hey, would you ever do a story set in New Orleans? And I said, well, I'm not sure. And they paused. He says, yeah, it's probably for the best. Because I got to tell you, almost nobody gets it right. So I was like, okay, right. Because, of course, that's the nature of these intricate cities where they have a very specific personality. To write about them well, you'd have to dig very deeply into the culture. But, Dan, I think I'm echoing from you.
Now, is that better?
We'll try that. Okay.
Okay. The best laid plans, some things work, some things don't. So thank you for carrying on there anymore. I appreciate that. So Liz Krieger from Covington said, this is a really big question, and you and I talked about this whenever I interviewed you in New Orleans, but to some extent, how is it that you really come to decide the premise of each book, because they've all been so different?
Yeah, and it's sort of like we were describing at the beginning. Something will strike me, just like the idea of rules of civility, and I'll write it down, and it may linger with me. And I'll have many ideas, but some of them really kind of sink their teeth into me, so that when I find myself walking somewhere, or running on the treadmill or what have you, or alone at a bar waiting for my wife to show up, for dinner, my mind will circle back to that the idea number 7. And, so yeah, that's interesting. I wonder what would happen if this, if that. And you start to think about it, and eventually what happens is it really grabs you, and you kind of pushes everything else to the side, and you start thinking about it more and more. So I don't think about, would it be a bestseller? I don't think about what does it mean thematically. I never think about that. I think about, is this premise, this idea, is it rich? Meaning, does it have enough avenues? As you start to imagine the story, can you sense that it's going to go in a lot of different directions productively, and into a world that will allow the reader to have a rich experience emotionally, intellectually, aesthetically. And that's an instinct. And sometimes, as many of you know, my newest book, which came out just 2 months ago, Table for Two, is a book of 6 short stories and a novella. And so, those come to me as ideas, same thing. But when they present themselves, you can usually sense that they don't have the capacity for the richness that I want when I'm, ultimately going to tackle a novel. I'm like, oh yeah, that'd be an interesting story if it was, 20 pages or 30, and everything that I should tell you about that story could be fit into that 20 pages. And so you kind of put that in the short story lane, as it were. And but otherwise, you have other ideas that sort of have the capacity to be novels. And as I say, I'm simultaneously imagining multiple of them. And when you get towards the end of something like A Gentleman in Moscow, you look at all these different piles and say, okay, what are we doing next? I'll say, all right, we're going to do this, the Lincoln Highway. But at that point, I've been thinking about the Lincoln Highway for probably 6 years, and I've filled notebooks already. So, I'm ready to go.
I presume that you've already started your next book.
Yes, I have.
Any secrets you can share with us?
It starts in Cairo at the end of the Second World War and ends in New York in 1999. But that is all I will tell you about it.
Well, that's more than I was anticipating. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Anything else that you'd really like to share with readers? I've gotten so many emails, Amor, about this book, even though, it came out a few years ago. People, and I reread it, and I got to say, I enjoyed it even more the second time than I did the first time.
Terrific. I frankly, that's my ambition as a writer, that you would have that experience. But no, please share the questions that they have about the book. They're nice enough to read it as a part of this book club. You're nice enough to suggest that they do so. So, if there's a thread of questions that I can address, I'd be happy to do so. Well,
Elise Diamant asked about, your time working in finance, and then your transition into full-time writing. And you were in finance for what, was it 20 years? Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
And you talk about how you made the decision to ultimately get out?
Yeah, it's not, there's nothing courageous about it when you look at the facts, because I was writing as a kid, and I moved to New York to be a writer. So I've been writing all my life at the time when I joined a friend of mine who had started an investment firm and went to work there. And for 10 years or so, I stopped writing while we were building the firm. But then I began writing fiction again. I was writing fiction while I had the job. I ended up writing Rules of Civility while I had the job. And when that became a bestseller, I retired. So it wasn't like there was this dramatic moment where I'm like, I'm giving up my job and I'm going to try to become a writer. It wasn't like that. It was doing both things at once, and the sequence of events worked out.
What do you think that your experience working in finance added to your perspective as a writer?
Nothing.
Really?
No.
Fascinating. Okay. Lisa Fennell says that she loved it when Dickey shows some maturity and brilliance by saying to Katie, if only we fell in love with people who were perfect for us, then there wouldn't be much fuss about love in the first place.
Yeah. I love that you select that. I'm sorry, what was the reader's name?
Lisa.
Lisa, thanks. And I'll tell you, I want to tell you 2 things about that moment. The first is that when a reader, if you go to amortowles.com, there's a contact page, your emails come right to me. So for instance, if we don't tackle your question today, you can just send it to me and I'll give you the answer, whatever. But so I hear from readers all the time. And when a reader says, here's a passage that I thought was really beautiful, or moved me, or it seemed insightful, I read it to my husband, or I wrote it down for my son, or whatever the circumstance. 99% of the time, that passage is something that I never would have said in the course of my daily life. And so what has happened is that I have created this person who I am not, with a personality that I do not have. I have put them in a situation in which I have never been, and they suddenly say, like that sentence that Dickie gives. And they usually come very fast for me off the keyboard, because they're almost coming out from outside me. And usually I hit the period, I'm like, oh, well done, Dickie. What a great observation of human nature, and of life. So I add this to that, because I remember this very vividly. That takes place on St. Patrick's Cathedral, steps of St. Patrick's Cathedral. And Dickie's coming, Katie has been, after their fling, sort of, she's been kind of distant. He's not sure why. So he's come and hunt her down by going to different churches. And he's found her, and he's sort of like, all right, so what's going on? They go outside and they have this thing. Now, the great thing about that moment to me is that what he really should do is, because he loves her, is he should say, oh, after hearing the story of Tinker, he should be, oh, what a cad. I cannot believe that gentleman would do that to you. Come back to my place. We'll have a glass of scotch and we'll put it behind us, and have a gay old time. That's what he should do, as one who's in love with her. Because this is an opening, in essence, right?
Right.
Mad at the guy. And he could come in and turn it around. And I remember writing it, kind of leaning in that direction, and imagining that they'd be going to his apartment. And I just remembered coming out, that he being like, oof, I think you're being a little hard on the guy. I think it's kind of impressive what he's done.
Yeah.
Setting these, Dickie talking, setting these rules for himself. I couldn't, Dickie saying I couldn't do that, which is so much truer to the nature that Dickie plays, to his personality. And so, and I love what happens is he's an easy character to underestimate, because he is so devil may care. He's constantly the life of the party, and he seems like he's sort of drifting over the surface of life in this very privileged way, of course. Mm-hmm. But yet, when the critical moment comes, he's also a deep-hearted, sensitive guy in his own way, and so shakes her, and that's what prompts her to then go find Tinker and to rethink her bitterness, right? And sort of recognize that she is being too hard on him, that she's probably not that different than he is anyway, and sort of opens the door for the two of them to have some kind of rapprochement. Now, one of the fun things about that moment to me, and I'll say this too, because it's kind of interesting. I'm not a research-driven writer. I'm an imagination-driven writer. But I designed that scene. I knew, I'd already begun drafting it, and I was doing a meeting in Midtown for my job, and I was walking downtown on my way back to my office, and I passed St. Patrick's Cathedral, and I thought, oh, wow, this is where the scene is. I should go in there. I've been in there before, but I should go back in and just see if there's anything that strikes me, or sit there for a moment. And I knew that the Pietà was going to be mentioned, so I went back over and looked at the Pietà, this sculpture of right. Mary holding the dead body of Jesus, sort of very beautiful, emotional statue, which is at the museum. At the cathedral. And so then I was like, okay, time to go. That was helpful. I'll incorporate that maybe into the story. So as I'm coming out, these giant cathedral doors are opened up right onto Fifth Avenue, which is where the front of the cathedral is. And as I'm coming out, there, framed in the doorway, is the statue of Atlas. This extraordinary Art Deco statue of Atlas holding the spheres, in essence, on his back. Mm-hmm. And I was like, oh, how crazy that these two things are opposite each other, right? The Pietà, which is this ultimate expression of fragileness, of weakness, or of a moment. I mean, obviously Jesus isn't weak. I just mean the fragileness of the human body, and someone who is being sacrificial, and who's a humble person, in contrast with this figure from Greek mythology who got the job of holding up the spheres as a punishment because he was too proud, And so it was almost like two worlds that Fifth Avenue is separating. And so that's a gift. That happens sometimes, where you just you walk into the circumstance that is perfect. All right, so that happens, and then I'm doing the scene, and then Dickie speaks, and in a way saves the day in his own sort of self in a way that damages his own interests. Okay, this is for those of you who read Gentlemen in Moscow. You may know, if you never realize it, that's fine. But Dickie Vanderwild plays a key role in A Gentleman in Moscow. At the end of Rules of Civility, it says that Dickie turned out all right in the epilogue. It says that he went to business school, and then he enrolled after Pearl Harbor, that he ended up being an officer in the Navy, and then was an attaché in the government. And so he shows up in Gentlemen in Moscow as an attaché to the embassy in Moscow, befriends the Count, and ultimately, is a spy and tries to recruit the Count. But there's a key moment in that book where the Count sort of has two encounters in short time. One with his childhood friend Mishka, and one with the security officer Osip. And they pose two different views of Russia. Mishka says that we have a history of destroying what is most beautiful in our culture. We do that. And it's a very sort of dark view, and because he's suffered a great deal. Osip then hears that, the security officer, and says, well, okay, I see that you're upset by your friend's observation, but maybe your friend is right, but that he just has the wrong attitude about it. Because maybe what is great about Russia right now is that we are prepared to do that. We're prepared to destroy these old things in order, like in America, to provide a better future for the citizens. And sitting around and protecting century-old or two-century-old cathedrals and palaces is not necessarily in the best interest of the people. You have to be willing sometimes to plow them under the ground, and that upsets the Count. And so he goes to the bar, and there's Dickie Vanderwild, who he's befriended. And what happens is it's just like the steps of St. Patrick's Cathedral, and that at this very low moment, the Count describes the two perspectives, and Dickie has this wonderful take on the two perspectives, which is, in essence, Socrates had these incredible ideas in ancient Greece. He never wrote them down. Socrates famously would only share his ideas orally. They were written down by others later. He was barefoot. He becomes imprisoned. He takes hemlock and kills himself, once he's been imprisoned. It's 1,000+ years ago, thousands of years ago. And what Dickie observes is, somehow we still know what he thought. Like, how crazy is that? This barefoot guy wandering around ancient Greece who won't even write down his ideas. And here, several thousand years later, we know what he thought. He said, so sometimes I think Dickie's saying, sometimes I think you just have the faith that wonderful things persist. And that really provides the Count with a big, sort of, as I say, a contrast to the view of Osip and the view of Mishka, and an uplifting. So I love the fact that Dickie, once again, the ever underestimatable Dickie, shows up and says the right thing at the right time.
Well, thank you so much. Believe it or not, our time is done. And if we didn't get to your question, please do email Amor, and I can tell you that he will email you back, because I've emailed him several times through the years, and just appreciate the time that you've taken. And we also are going to take this moment to announce a new book for our third Louisiana Inspired. It is a nonfiction book, and it is called I Never Thought of It That Way. It's how to have fearlessly curious conversations in dangerously divided times. So we are looking forward to that read, and Monica Guzman, its author, has agreed to join us for the conversation as well. So thank you so much for joining us, Amor. John, I'm going to let you take over and get us back to Amor. There we go. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry for the technical glitch, but appreciate you for helping us carry right on.
My pleasure. Thank you, everybody.
Right.
Thanks for reading my work.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.